Well, hello and welcome to another Creative Critique Live. This is episode number 3, take 2. But I think we are in good shape tonight. Everything seems to be working okay. We have a good connection. I have a good connection to the internet. We have quite a few people with us tonight, so appreciate everyone joining us and joining me here. So I'm looking forward to having a good webinar here. Just a few things for those of you who are perhaps joining for the first time. This is my attempt to give you the best feedback and critique possible on your images. I want to be as fair as I can. I want to be as honest as I can. But the primary goal is to be as helpful as I possibly can, to give you feedback that you can use, that you can build on to improve your work. It's not about judging your work necessarily. It's about providing you with ideas and insights and maybe a different perspective that you may not have that would allow you to, again, hopefully improve. And I am basing these suggestions, these insights on years of experience on my end, not only studying composition and studying photography, but also teaching. And when, as they say, when you teach, you learn a tremendous amount. And I've learned more from teaching probably than I have from my own photography because I've taken those lessons and applied them to my work as well. So I'm using generally conventional and traditional principles or guidelines, if you want to call them, of composition. I'm using ideas that have stood the test of time, that have been around for us for hundreds of years. And I think that they build a strong foundation for any kind of photography that you're doing, not just landscapes or nature or what have you. There's always room for improvement and room to innovate, right? To be unconventional, to think outside the box, as they say. But as Twyla Tharp says, before you think outside the box, you first have to have a box, and that's where the guidelines and the principles come in. You may perhaps not agree with everything that I suggest, and that's okay. Critique, the word critique is one where you evaluate everything. You evaluate what you're hearing, and you evaluate also your own work. And so I'm always open to learning, to new ideas. But the goal here is for you to take the suggestions and, again, build on them. Use them as a stepping stone. And I think that's how we all can learn from those that came before us. And most of it, if not all of what I know, aside from my personal experience, has been built on others that came before me. One thing I'm going to do a little bit differently in this webinar is that I'm going to stop a little bit earlier than I have in the past. I'm going to try to stop 15 minutes or 20 minutes earlier if I can. And that is so that I can answer more of your questions. I mean, this was the original idea to do this, was to have more interaction, more discussion. And in the first 2 webinars, I've really been so focused and so intent on getting through all the critiques and giving you as much information that by the time I got through all the images, there was no time for questions. So I'm going to try to give a little more time for that. If you have questions, please put them in the question section of the website, not in the chat, which is on the left-hand side, but the questions on the right-hand side. There's like a little icon of a person. Leave the questions there, and then when I stop, I'll look through the questions. If you're referencing an image, just mention the image. If it's your image, just mention your name or what have you, and I'll go back and pull up the image and kind of answer the question that way, or any other questions you might have, as long as it's not too far off topic, so we can stay on the general theme of photography, Lightroom, creativity, etc. The other thing also is that before I get into the images, I just wanted to spend a couple minutes talking about something that I've gotten some feedback and questions on, which is I just want to clarify some of the definitions that Lightroom uses for some of its tools. So you will hear me using words interchangeably, or sometimes I get confused about the words, things like mask and brush and filter and things like that. And I just want to make sure that everyone out there, all of you, understand exactly what I'm talking about and understand the concept of how Lightroom edits or develops an image, and whether it's a global adjustment or a local adjustment, and what the actual tools are. Because the more you understand what the tools are and what they can do and how they work, the better off you'll be, because you'll be able to have more control over how to use this powerful tool that we call Lightroom. So with that said, let's get into that, and then we'll look at your images. Okay, so I'm gonna go into one of my pictures here just to show you, just to do this little part of the webinar here with the tools, okay? And then we'll go from there. So when you're in the develop module, all right, all of your global adjustments are all of these panels, okay? Global adjustments mean that the adjustments apply or will be applied to the entire image. That doesn't mean that you can't get it to work on a certain part of the image, but it's still going to apply to the entire image. There's no way for you to isolate one actual section of the image from another. That's what we call global tools or global adjustments, and that happens in all of these panels. In order to get into the local adjustments, we have to go up here, right below the histogram where we have the tools here. The first one is called the adjustment brush. Second one is called the radial filter, and the third one is called the graduated filter. Now, what's important here is that the difference between the tools is only how we create the mask. And that comes to the second definition. What we're doing when we use local tools is that we're creating a mask. And a mask, you could think of a mask as a selection. A mask is just a way of selecting part of the image. They call it a mask because perhaps that's borrowed from Photoshop. And if you mask something off, like when you use a masking tape, you tape over something and everything else gets the paint, for example. The part that you tape off with masking tape doesn't get the paint. Of course, in Lightroom, we can invert the mask so that the part that we tape over or mask over gets the effect and everything doesn't get the effect. But the general concept is that we're creating different types of masks. And the reason why we have the different tools is because they each create a different kind of mask, and they're better at creating one kind of mask over another. So as an example, the most basic mask is the adjustment brush. When I select the adjustment brush, we're able to create a mask that basically it works kind of like a brush. So as I click and drag over an area of the image, it creates an effect. Now, the reason why you don't see the mask is because I myself like to use these tools without seeing the actual mask. I like to leave the mask off. In other words, that red overlay that shows you what the mask is, I like to leave that off because I like to see what the tool is doing to the image instead of that red mask. Now, others like to see the mask so they see what they're selecting in the image, but I like to leave that off. If you want to see the mask, though, two ways to do that is to hover over this, what Lightroom calls a pin. And the pin is basically the way you control that particular mask, or how you are able to select that mask, adjust it, edit it, or delete it. So as I hover over this pin, that's the mask that I just created by brushing over the image. If you like to work with the mask on all the time, the way to do that is down here in the toolbar, there's a little checkbox that you can click on, and then regardless of whether I hover over this pin or not, the mask will stay on. Like I said, my preference is not to see the mask because I feel that it bothers me and it's a distraction for me. Okay, so I like to leave that off, and I'll uncheck that over here. And again, by hovering over the pin, you can see the mask. Just checking here and making sure everybody doesn't have a question. Hopefully everybody can hear me. If anyone is having a problem, just leave it in the question area, but I think everyone seems to be okay. All right, so that's the adjustment brush. Now, if we select and by the way, let's say I wanted to delete that mask that I just created because I really don't want that effect here. I can click it, that selects that particular mask, and then I hit the delete key and that deletes it. Now, when you apply a mask, like so, I'm applying it again, okay? Once that mask is applied, then you have the ability to apply many different types of adjustments to what is underneath that mask. So for example, exposure, contrast, saturation. We can do things like texture, add texture, reduce texture. Okay, and you can apply these all in combination. All right, so that's one particular mask. You can modify this mask by either adding more to it. Let me create a stronger effect, adding more to it, or you can enable the erase brush. I like to use the keyboard shortcut, which is Option or Alt on the PC, and it converts the additive brush, meaning a brush that's adding, to a subtractive brush or brush that's deleting. And now we can go in and delete from this mask, like so. Okay? In order to control the size of the brush itself, and notice that the additive brush and the delete brush have different sizes that are remembered. Okay, so the delete brush has a smaller size and the additive brush has a bigger size. And you can adjust that. And the way to adjust the size of the brush is by using the left and right bracket keys, which are above the return key. So I can make this additive brush bigger and smaller. And if I press Option, I can also make this one bigger or smaller. And they'll remember their respective sizes. Okay. So that's the regular adjustment brush. If I select the graduated filter, again, I'm creating a mask, but the mask is being created now in a different manner. It's created along a vertical edge. So the mask now is extending from one side of the picture to the other along this line. And let me add an effect so you can see what the mask is. Okay, and if I hover over this pin, that shows you what the actual mask is. That red overlay is the mask itself. When I come away from that, you see the effect without the mask. Again, that's the way I prefer to see it, so I can see what it's doing to the image. And then this mask, which is called the graduated filter, we can rotate it to change the orientation on what part of the image it's affecting. These three lines represent the gradation of the mask, the gradation from 100% to 0. So at this part of the image, the effect that I'm adding, which is minus 2.5 stops of minus exposure, is being applied at 100%, and then it gradates down to 50%, and then here to 0%. And so that's what these three lines are for, is to control the smoothness of the gradation. If you want a very smooth gradation of the effect, you spread them out. If you want a very abrupt or hard edge to the effect, you bring them close together like that. And by the way, this gradation, which is easier to see and appreciate in the graduated filter because it's called graduated filter, is also available in the adjustment brush. That's what the two circles are for. So there's two circles. The inside circle represents the effect at 100%, and the outside circle is, the space between the two circles is the gradation, the feathering. And once you hit the outside of the circle, you have no more effect. And the way to adjust the feathering is by this control here. So again, this is adjusting the gradation of the effect. So this gives you a very hard edge. Let me make a stronger adjustment. Very hard edge. But if I make the feathering very smooth, it's a very soft edge. Okay? And that's very similar to the graduated filter here, where we have that same control, but over a straight edge. And just like the adjustment brush, we can also add to or delete from this mask by enabling the brush. If I click on brush here, not the adjustment brush up here, because that goes to a different filter, but with this graduated filter enabled, if I click on brush, then I have a brush with a plus sign, which means it's an additive brush, and it can add to the existing mask that is created by the graduated filter. I can also hold down Option and delete from that graduated filter to modify the mask itself. So remember, I had initially applied a graduated filter, but I modified it now by deleting some of that graduated filter. So we have a very kind of customized graduated filter. And again, you could see how this makes it very powerful because you can create all kinds of masks to adjust different parts of your image. And the same thing applies with the radio filter. The radio filter, the only difference is that it just gives you a kind of a shortcut to create a round, a circular type of mask. That's all it is. It's the same as the others, except it gives you a shortcut to create a circular mask. If I wanted to create a mask like this with the adjustment brush, I could, but it would take you a long time because you'd have to, go around and around and around until you left the center out. This just gives you a shortcut to that. And similarly, like the other tools, well, actually, this one is a little bit different. this one allows you to invert the mask. So instead of selecting this title pool here, okay, actually, I'm sorry. Right now I'm selecting everything but the title pool because the mask itself is in red and that's what I'm affecting in the image. So for example, if I lower the exposure, you see that everything gets darker except the title pool. If I wanted to reverse the mask so that the title pool gets affected and not everything outside of it, you come down here and you click on invert, and voila, that inverts the mask. And now everything within that circle is being affected. And just like the other tools, you have control over the feathering or the gradation or how smooth it is. So that's a very hard edge. That's very smooth. And you also have the ability to use the brush, right? Use a brush with this radial filter to add to it like that. Okay, so the actual tools give you a starting point. The graduated filter gives you kind of a quick and easy way to have a filter that's along a straight line, a straight edge. Radial filter for circular type things, and the adjustment brush kind of more freeform. But really you can achieve almost identical things with all three of them. It just depends on how efficient and how quickly and how fast you want to get to the effect. And those are the things that I show you when I'm working on my own work, but I'm also working on your images. I'll show you which tools I think will get us to the desired effect sooner and faster. And it also highlights why it's important to have a good understanding of what you're going to do with an image, because then you have a better sense of which tool is going to help you to get there. And of course, it requires practice and getting more comfortable with it. Okay, so hopefully that gave you some insights into the tools there. And I will now move into before I move on to just a few questions here. I'm not sure if there's a way to change the mask color from red to some other color. There may be. I've never found it, or actually I should be honest, I've never tried to look for it. I primarily use the red, and I don't really use the mask because, as I said, I like to see the effect that I'm applying to the image, because that effect in turn gives me feedback as to whether the image is getting better or not. I like that aesthetic feedback. Oh, I darkened part of the image and I see how it got darker. If I had that red mask on it, it would bother me. Whereas without it, I can continue to kind of work with the image. All right. Okay, so let's get into your images. So this first image is by, I believe, is Mary Jo Beck. And what I like about this picture is, I think, the very clear way, well, two things jump out at me right away. One is the very nice way that my eye kind of picks up and follows a path along the bottom here. So my eye kind of flows this way. I like the repetition of the rocks. Of course, the color coming back up this way and then out into the sky and then returning again. You can even enter this way, but again, you're going to pick up these lines and your eye is going to kind of bounce around from these areas. And that's because, one, we have a nice strong green texture that brings us in. So this is important here because that creates a nice way to get in. And then these shapes kind of create points that your eye kind of bounces around and picks up and repeats, and we get into the sky. So I like that. I also like the nice use of what I like to call active and passive areas. And I'm going to be talking about some compositional concepts as we go along. And this is one that I like to think about. There's something that I think is real useful to think about, which is active and passive areas. And so these areas here, the land and the rocks, form what I would call more of an active area, because your eye sees a lot of texture and color and shape, and it's got a lot of textural dimension to it. And then the more passive area is the sky. It's not 100% passive because we've got those clouds in there, but let's say the sky was clear blue, no clouds at all. That would be a very passive area. In fact, we'd probably call that something like negative space. So this is related to negative space, but it has to do with where your eye is attracted to and where your eye has a chance to rest. And you always want to have a nice balance between this, because an image that is all active can be fatiguing. So I like that about this image. And I also like, again, the simplicity. We've got reds, in the mostly warm colors on the rock faces. We've got the greens down here, which are nice complementary colors. Red and greens are opposites. And then we've got the nice blue sky with some clouds that, again, make a nice pattern. I think what we can improve here is really just the sense of light, the sense of the light striking the rock faces. The image needs a bit more energy. There's a lot of energy when you're in the desert and that light, the beautiful sunlight comes up, and all of you that have been in this kind of environment know what I'm talking about. It's just this amazing amount of energy, and we want to try to recreate that or to put that back into the image. So compositionally, I think it works really well. I think it's just a matter of now interpreting it to make the image a little more alive. So what I would do is you can see right here that we're not really taking advantage of the whites. We're not really pushing the brights of the image as far as they can go. If we push the whites up, we have room in the histogram here that'll give us more dynamic range, more contrast, more energy. So I'm gonna hold down the Option key, click and drag on the white slider. That tells us we're clipping that area. I'll back off from that a little bit. Check the blacks. Same thing, we're pretty good there. Pull down the highlights a little bit. Okay, and already you can see the difference that makes. There's the before and there's the after. And don't worry, I'm gonna show you side-by-side images this time of the before and after, so we can see how the images change when I'm done. Next, I'm going to add some clarity. A little bit of vibrance, maybe open up a little bit of the shadows. Okay, again, just making the image more alive, giving it some more dynamic range and contrast. All right, I think we've done that already, has made a big difference. And then I would add some very subtle dodging and burning to emphasize that movement that I talked about at the beginning when I talked about your eye sort of following the image through the picture. So I'm going to, to do this, to do dodging and burning on selective areas, for me, the most useful and powerful tool is the adjustment brush, because I'm not working along a straight line. I'm not trying to put a circle around something. I just want to use the brush in a very free-form kind of way to hit up different spots in the picture to make them brighter or darker. So the adjustment brush for me does that very well. And I like to use just a preset here, which is darken. That just sets it at minus 0.25 or minus 3.30 exposure. You can do that manually. But so I'm going to add a bit more shadow in here in areas that already have shadow. So that increases the sense of light, because again, everything is relative. If we darken an area that is close to a bright area, we're going to make the bright area appear even brighter, because we're making the shadow a little darker. And these shadows, I would say, aren't that important. They are not areas that we need to go and investigate. They really provide a way to emphasize that feeling of light. Darken these shadows in here, darken just maybe the little rock back there, maybe darken that up in there. And I'll show you the mask when I'm done. Okay, so here's a very important one that's very subtle, right? This rock, why did I darken this rock? Because, number one, by darkening this area, the light that is hitting these bushes here becomes even stronger. And it also brightens or makes this part of the rock even brighter. And again, it just creates the sensation of light. And that's the thing that's most beautiful about an image, is that beautiful sensation of light, which we all respond to. Maybe same thing over here. And then I'm going to make the brush a little smaller and just maybe give a few little indications of some shadows in here. Again, I'm not fighting with the image. I'm fighting with the light. I'm not fighting. I'm adding to the light that's already there, or taking away from the light that's already and not in those areas. Same thing up here. I'm going to reduce the flow. And some of these darker areas, those stains that we all are very familiar with, I'm going to darken them to just give the image a little bit more bite, right? This rock here, a little more shadow and darkness in those areas. Now I'm going to create a new brush. Oh, let me go back to this one again, and you can see the mask. Okay, that's the mask, those red areas. But I don't need to see those red areas. I already knew that it was working when I applied the brush, and I could see that I darkened that area and areas around it got brighter. That's what I use as a way to tell that the mask is working. I could even do it in there as well, like that. Okay, new brush. And this one is going to be lighten, which is to brighten parts of the image. And this I'm going to use again. I'm going to increase the flow to 100%. By the way, the flow, for those that may not be familiar, the flow is another word for opacity. So if the flow is at 100, that means that I'm applying this adjustment at 100% of the strength that I set here in the exposure or whatever other adjustment I'm using. If I drop the flow to 50, that means that the brush is being applied at 50% of what I set here. And you might ask, well, why just not drop it 50% in the control here? Well, the purpose is that if I use flow at 50%, I can apply it over and over again in the same area and it builds up. So it kind of layers my strokes to get a darker effect. So it gives you a lot of control. But in this case, I just want the flow at 100%. And I'm going to maybe touch this area there, maybe there. Remember that I added that dark adjustment here. I'm going to add one right there. And notice how big my feathering is. The feathering on the brush. I'm not being very precise. I'm not being very surgical. I'm making very broad adjustments, but in key areas that emphasize this movement of your eye. Here's a good one right here. All these bushes right here catching that light. Okay, maybe down here, maybe a little right there. I'm not going to apply it over here. There's a good reason for that, because we already talked about where the most important part of this image is here. I don't want your eye to start wandering over here because that leads you to the edges of the frame, and we don't want that. We want the viewer to stay engaged and interested inside the frame. I think I'm pretty happy with that. Let me show you what that adjustment looks like. By the way, I can turn off just the local adjustments I've made. That's without them, and that's with them. Okay. And then last but not least, I'm going to use a graduated filter because I want something across the sky. And instead of using a brush to start brushing in parts of the sky, which takes a long time, I'm just going to drop this filter like this. And I'm going to use the range mask control to tell this filter only to select blue colors. How do I do that? Well, that's another way that you can control what a mask selects with the range mask adjustment here. So right now it's off, but if I turn it on, I can either set it to color or luminosity, and I'm only going to show you color now. I'll show you luminosity in another image. I'll set it to color, and this allows me to select a color that I want this filter only to work on. And I'm going to say that I want this color to be, by the way, you can click or you can drag out a range of colors, like a square. So I'm going to select like that. And now this filter, this graduated filter, is only going to be selecting those colors. How do I know? Because if I hover over the mask, look how the mask has cut around the rocks, because the rocks are red, but I told the graduated filter, I told it to limit its range to the blues. Okay. Now I can basically pull down on the highlights a little bit, tiny bit. I can add some clarity to the sky. Maybe add even some whites just to get a little bit more brightness out of that sky. Okay, and I think we're pretty good right there. So that's the before, that's the after. There's your compare view left and right, the original on the left and the finished image on the right. I think the right one, it's subtle, but definitely much more energetic, much more engaging. I think the light and the shadows are much more effective and interesting. And the other thing that I would recommend is to Mary Jo is in the future with images like this, it's a nice composition. I think if you could introduce something a little bit more intimate in the foreground, something to really give you more of a sense of depth and perspective, that works, especially in the desert where we feel this vastness, and that vastness is something that can be conveyed if you get a little bit closer to the foreground and let the wide angle lens do its trick, which is to expand the scene. The other thing that I noticed as well is that there's this little white spot down here, and that's very easy to take out by clicking on or bringing up the spotting tool. Click on that, and you can pretty much drag this anywhere, and that gets rid of that. Okay, thank you. Next image is by Stephen Bridget. And what I like about this image is, first, I like the layering of the different elements. You've got that foreground with the grasses and the greens, and then you've got that beautiful water with the turquoise colors and reflections. Then you've got that distant shoreline with the trees, and the mountains building up to that peak in the clouds. It's very majestic, very sort of uplifting. It's got a lot of energy building up to the top of the image. And the composition is fairly simple. We're not seeing lots of distracting elements. Everything feels kind of unified. So I like that. I think what can make all of those things even better is to create a little more separation. Right now it feels a little bit, to me, it feels a little bit or looks a little bit too flat. By flat, I mean that everything looks like it's on one plane, everything kind of stacked on top of everything else. And I'd like to see a little more space in there, a little more separation. So how can we do that? Well, the way you can create space is with color and tonality. By changing the tones of things, we can separate things out and make them look further away or closer to us. Here's an example of that. I don't think I need to do anything to the image in terms of the regular adjustments. Maybe drop the blacks a little bit. So let's see, let's get those blacks down to where they belong, somewhere around there. Okay, already that's better. We've got more depth into the image. Expanding the tonal range. Just that little area at the bottom is clipping, which is okay. Something like that. Next thing I would do is, let's do the whites as well. Okay, we'll stop there, right there. Okay, now I'm gonna grab or enable an adjustment brush, make this one darken or dodge, and I'm going to darken that line of trees. And notice I'm just doing one straight adjustment right across those trees. No need to select anything with auto mask or anything like that. I just want to darken that general shape. And by doing that, that instantly makes those trees come forward. It makes them look a little more dense, and they separate from the back, okay? If I exaggerate that, see, that's the exaggeration. I don't want to go that far, but you can see already how that separates them. Whereas if I make them lighter, they actually blend into the background. Now there's no separation at all. So I'm going to darken them to make them come forward just a little bit. Next thing I'm going to do is the same principle, but we're going to apply that same principle now to the foreground to make the foreground more active, more energetic. It's a little bit flat now. By flat, I mean that all the tones are kind of blending into each other. I can't tell whether the shape is in front of or behind, whether this is a shadow. It all looks kind of mushy, and I want to separate those shapes out a bit. So I'm going to darken this area here that's already dark. Darken this area here like that. Maybe a little bit of the side of this little bush there. I'm going to drop the flow a little bit to make this adjustment now that I'm going to apply a little more gradual. Some of these greens in the water. Okay, and then I'm going to create a new brush to create a new mask, and this will be lighten. And I'm just going to highlight a few little spots here. Let's put our flow back up at 100, and we'll highlight a few little spots here. Maybe not that one. Why not that one? Because I find now that it takes me to the edge too much. This is the reason why I don't like to have the red mask on, because I can see what that adjustment did. It made that little green patch brighter. I don't like it, so I can undo to take it away. Okay, I can even darken it if I want. If I had that red overlay there, that would just be an extra step that I have to do to turn it off, etc. Okay, and I'll keep adjusting here. So that's my dodging, brightening, and the other pin, basically I used this pin here on the trees. I also used it down in the foreground. That's what I'm darkening. Now I'm going to create a new brush, and I'll make this one darken. And I just want to add a little bit more texture to this rock up here. And I'm going to do that by, I don't know if I want to use exposure or a little bit of clarity. Something like that. I'm also going to darken just some parts of this mountain just to give it some variation. Like so. And I'm also going to go back to this mask or this brush that is darkening and also add it to kind of some of the water in the foreground here like that. And actually I'm going to do that. That's too strong. I'm going to lower the flow and just do it like that. Okay. And then last but not least, I'm going to come down to HSL controls, and I want to darken the sky, or basically what I like to call a virtual polarizer or digital polarizer. I'm going to come down to HSL. I'm going to select luminosity, select the blue channel, pull it down, and that makes the sky darker. That's very dark, too much. Something around there. By darkening the sky, that helps to separate the sky from the mountain. It pushes the mountain up a little bit, also separates our clouds. And I think I'm pretty good there. I think the image now has a lot more depth to it and energy. And I think that works a lot better now. So overall, good, clean, simple composition. I just think that the editing needs to really provide more depth and dimension. All right. Next image is by Paul Lewis. Thank you, Paul, for sharing. So this image is very interesting because we got this beautiful sort of scene looking out into the water, very simple, some grasses catching the warm light. Sun is rising. I assume the sun is rising in the morning off camera, off to the right. That strong light coming in. And we've just got this simple, clean, vast kind of look, a view of the ocean, but the chair is there. You take that chair out of the picture and really, it doesn't really say a whole lot. With the chair there, I think that adds a little element to it. It's kind of a little story. Is the chair waiting for someone? Did someone leave? Is someone coming? Anytime you can, or anytime an image points to the human element, there's always a little bit of an extra story, that little message, and I think that's kind of interesting. It's not something we see all the time, so I really like that. I really like the kind of the story that doesn't necessarily tell a story, but it opens up your imagination and asks questions. And images that ask questions or suggest, as I talked about in previous webinars, are almost always preferable to images that really just tell you exactly what there is to look at and nothing else. I think what we can do here to improve it is, one, my eye tends to want to drift out of the frame, out in this direction. I think we want to keep the viewer inside without losing that energy of the light coming in. And I think maybe just to darken some of the edges, again, to really kind of zone in on the fact that it's about whatever the chair and the person that's going to sit in it, whatever that story is. So the way I would do that is, one, again, I would probably use a graduated filter pulled in from the right hand side, and I'm going to make it fairly wide, or make that transition very smooth so that the effect is more gradual. Because if I don't make it gradual, it's going to look obvious. It's going to look it's going to look too obvious, and I don't want that. I want it to look gradual. So we're going to pull that away, pull that out like this, and you see how it makes it much more natural looking. We'll pull on the exposure, pull on the highlights. We'll add a little bit of clarity to make the clouds jump out a little more. Okay, maybe even make it a tiny bit warmer, like so. I can also go down to HSL once again and darken the sky a little bit. I'm also going to go down to effects and add a little bit of a vignette on the corners. And then I think I'm going to go to some local adjustments. Again, dodging and burning. I'm going to darken maybe some parts here of the image. Let's put the flow up at 100. maybe down here, just to give us more depth and shadow down here so that we really feel that light coming up above the horizon. And maybe darken a little bit here, a little bit here. And then a new brush, which will be lighten. And again, around the center of interest or the subject, which is that chair. All right, and it doesn't need a whole lot. I think it was pretty close. Just wanted to give it a little bit of help, and I think that is the idea. You kind of want the eye to really just find that chair and then what it represents looking out at that horizon, versus the original. It's a little bit too open. By that I mean that your eye can really wander around the image and it loses, I think, its focus, its center of interest. All right, so otherwise, really nice. Thank you. This next image is by Jeff Bleeman. Thank you, Jeff, for sending. Well, first, the drama of the scene, the vividness of nature, right? The wild, remote, sort of untouched way that the image feels. We've got these beautiful trees, or these I guess, dead trees that kind of pull you in this way, strong leading line, and then up to essentially what is the image, which is these granite peaks with the clouds overhead, of course, raw nature, and warm, beautiful light coming in from the top creates a lot of energy, a lot of drama, very dramatic. And I like that. I like the general flow. So again, your eye essentially comes in on this side, flows up and comes up here. That is what I think is the strength of the image. I like the layering, foreground, middle ground, which is kind of this middle ground here, and then the background and the clouds. The problem is that this line that I drew here, I feel doesn't go as smoothly as it should. It actually, when I look at it with my eye, I'm like, oops, sorry. When I look at it with my eye, I'm kind of here, and then I go around here, and then I might jump up here, but then I'm back here again. Why is that happening? I think what's happening is that there's a little bit too much information in the foreground. Maybe not so much here, but this middle ground here. A lot of information, a lot of detail, a lot for the eye, for the viewer to have to take in before we get up to what we really want to get up to, which is the mountains, right? Like that's what we really want to enjoy and appreciate. And I think that in a way, all of this here, you could think of it as kind of a distraction. It works because there's a repetitive pattern there, so I can see the inkling for Jeff to want to include that as a repetitive pattern, but it's a lot of information, and I think that disrupts the beauty of the cliffs and the mountains in the back. So, how can we improve that with this particular image? I would say maybe to tone down the energy of that middle section, tone down this area here. And the way we could do that is, I hope, I'm not sure this will work, but the way we can do that is by an adjustment brush, and I'm going to, let's say we use clarity, and I'm going to pull down clarity a lot. And maybe also a little bit of contrast, just a tiny bit. And we can apply that in here to smooth that out a tiny bit. Okay? And in order so that we also increase the foreground to background, we're going to try to make the foreground a little bit closer to us so that it separates it from this middle ground. So I'm going to create a new brush, make this one lighten, and maybe just brighten these areas around here, these grasses that are in our immediate foreground. Another mask or brush We'll make this one darken. And I'm going to darken some of these areas around the areas that I just added. Okay. So I think that allows our eyes to appreciate the foreground, appreciate the middle ground. We have that connection between the trees and all of the trees, and we see the context of the image. However, I think that the mountains in the back are the stars of the show. They tell the story. They are the thing that I believe Jeff was attracted to. Take those mountains away, and Jeff doesn't make this picture. You leave the mountains in there and create a different foreground, Jeff makes this picture. I think that that's what he was attracted to. And so I think that it's just another situation where we are tempted to put more information than we really need. It's a natural thing. We all do it. And I think that this just helps to simplify it without still losing the beauty of the landscape. There's one other area over here that when looking at it, I would probably tone this down a little bit as well back there. But I think you guys get the idea. You want to make sure that before, when I talked about active and passive areas, I felt that this was a little bit too active and needed to be more passive to let very active and also very active be more, to play a more important role, okay, to be more important, to really help the viewer move through the image from front to back. All right, thank you. Next, this image is by Ed McCrane. Thanks, Ed, for sharing. I think that the composition is really interesting. I like the way your eye moves down this path from the foreground grasses, close up, then we get to this middle ground, and then out to the bay and the marina and the ocean in the back. So I think the composition is generally okay. I think I would probably get rid of this area here on the right. Oh, I'm sorry, on the left, and maybe come down a little bit. Something like that. I think that cleans it up and makes it simpler. I think what the composition needs, what the picture needs, is light. Without light, you don't have strong highlights and shadows. You don't have the feeling of light, of warmth or coolness. You don't have a lot of the elements that make an image really evocative and interesting. In fact, the very little light that's in the picture, which is creating, I think, the only thing that's interesting in terms of what is in the composition, not from a composition standpoint, but just in terms of the light, is this area back here. It's not until we get to this part of the image back here where we see variation in light. I know this is not, what you made a picture of, but you see here, that is much more interesting and energetic because there's light there. There's reflection from the sky. We've got blues, we've got reds, we've got oranges, we've got complementary colors, we've got tension. However, we don't have any of that in the original, and it's simply because the light wasn't there. So again, composition is critically important. I think that part of the image is fairly well done, but the light is the key element that we can't predict, but it must be in a picture to make a picture interesting. So composition is good. Just work on your awareness of light, work on making sure that you're using light to increase. Right? Imagine light here, that would increase movement. We would have highlights and shadows. Your eyes would really follow this path and make it much more energetic and interesting. Flat light, especially when it's spread out like this, just doesn't give us that sense of drama, and that's something that we need. Next image is by Frank Field. Thank you for sending. So this image is really nice. I like the black and white because it makes it more graphic in nature, much more abstract. I can sort of hear the sound of the surf and the breeze and so forth. Very nice that way. Very nice and open. That beautiful sky with the clouds. Very uplifting. Very dramatic. I think what can be improved here, which I don't think is anything that I can do with cropping, because it really would require a movement of camera. But one thing is that we've got two shapes, and Another thing you have to think about in composition is something I call, or it's called spatial relationships. Relationships between objects. We got this shape here, which is really big shape, and another shape over here. And they are placed in such a way that I feel the image is a little bit weighted too much to the left. There's nothing to balance that. Yes, we've got this beautiful cloud, but it's not even off on the right here. It's above these two shapes. We really don't have a counterbalance on this side of the image, and I feel that it weighs too much over here. This leading line on the right-hand side is interesting, except that it's one leading line by itself. And because it's one leading line, you could argue that it leads you in or it leads you out. It's not like we have multiple lines or waves that kind of create a repetitive pattern pulling you into the image. So I think when you have two of something, or another compositional concept is to try to keep things in odd numbers, right? 3s, 5s, and 7s are more interesting to us than 2, 4, and 6 because with even numbers, it's easier to have something that has symmetry, and we kind of like things that are not symmetrical. So we have two shapes here. We kind of need a third. If we had another rock over here, another landform, imagine now that would really balance the image out. What I would do to improve this particular image is just make this shape more interesting. And the way I would do that is by using some dodging and burning. I'm going to say lighten and really, again, give us more a sense of the light, more of that energy of the light. It's a little too flat and dead for me now. And it needs to have more of that warm light that we see back here. It's not in shadow, it's getting direct light. So something like that. That connects it a little bit better to the light that's back here. Maybe brighten that up as well so it doesn't become subservient to the ocean. The other thing I would do is I would create a new brush, and we'll call this one darken, or we'll use it to darken parts of the image. And maybe darken some of these areas here. Again, just to make this left-hand side more interesting. It looks like there's a little path here. Make that a little more obvious. The other thing I would also do is, I'm going to create a new brush here. I'm going to use this one to brighten and also to take out some of the shadows of this shoreline here, which I think is too strong and pulls our eye down when our eye should be going back and into the image. Not down, because down doesn't take us anywhere. We want to move through the image. So this is, I believe, it's a little bit too dark. That shape is a little too dark. It's interesting, I like it, but it could be a little bit brighter or not as dark. By making that a little brighter or not as strong, not as tonally powerful, it allows our eye to move along this landmass and back towards the lighthouse. And the lighthouse, which is the most obvious thing that we see, I also think needs to have a little bit more tension, right? A little more light. So I'm just going to use a little tiny brush here to just give it a little bit more light. Something like that. And maybe another brush to darken some of the water in the foreground so that we have a little bit more variation in this water. In fact, here's an example where if I wanted to create just slight variation, I can drag a graduated filter, something like that, spread it out so it's nice and gradual, and give that foreground a little bit of darkening so that your eye wants to move into the picture. So again, that's the differences between the two images. I find this one's a little bit kind of ambiguous. Yes, we know that the lighthouse is there, but it doesn't really jump out at us. We have to do a lot of work to get back there. And if the lighthouse is not the thing that you want people to see, well, then it's going to be a distraction. Over here, I think we're telling them to move and to move to the back part of the image here. It creates more movement, more energy, and they don't get stuck in this white area down here. This also allows them to kind of move towards the brighter area back to the center of interest, and then they can kind of move around. One last thing I would probably do as well is another graduated filter, something like that. Again, spread it out and make it very even just to darken that side of the picture so that our eye doesn't want to just float out the top right-hand side of the frame up here. All right. Okay, thank you. Next. This image is by Donald Johnson. Thanks, Donald, for sending. I like the feel of this picture. I like the mood, the ambiance of the fog in the background. I love the softness of fog and the trees as they kind of recede into the distance. You can pick up some repeating elements here. There's another cliff over here, has some more pine trees on it, and back into the distance. Like that a lot. I like the effect of the sense of foreground to background. This tree here is really close to us and on the kind of one side of the picture. And then it allows you to kind of, your eye wants to explore. Compositionally, I think what is a challenge here, what is something that I think is, and I've had this experience myself too, is that when you place things close to the edge, again, back to spatial relationships, this shape here and its proximity to the edge of the frame doesn't quite feel like it's resolved. It doesn't feel like it's balanced out. It feels like it's just hanging off the frame. Or I would say it feels like it's sticking into the frame because everything else has a certain amount of unity to it, and this doesn't quite fit as well as it can. And I think that's a problem. The other thing is this here, obviously is something that we can get rid of. This is a problem because it just is a distraction. It feels like it's encroaching on the frame and it shouldn't. So this is something we could remove with a simple spotting tool. And again, I'm not going to do something perfect here. I just want to give you guys the idea of what I would do. Something like that. I would also crop this down. I think that would help a little bit to get rid of some of that empty space, which isn't doing much for us. We've already got this fog. Maybe come up a little bit from the bottom. And the reason why I'm doing this is to create more of this movement left and right versus up and down. The more we have this up and down movement, the more the left side of the picture feels like it's kind of encroaching in the picture. And then I would probably open up the exposure here and the image as a whole. Add some clarity. Maybe add some, I'm going to go to HSL and see if I can add a little bit more definition in the sky. See that? There's a little bit of blue in there we can pull down. Maybe in a little bit of dehaze, which gives us a little more depth back here. Again, just trying to make that connection between the left and the right-hand side. Overall, the feel of the picture, I really like. I like the mood of the picture. I think the compositional problem is that this is unresolved. It just weighs too much on the left side of the picture. And again, this is the thing where you would have to reframe in the field, try to include maybe another tree or two so that it feels more balanced instead of one lone tree, so that you have more unity, more continuity, and your eye doesn't continue to come over here. No matter how much you go over here, you keep getting pulled over here. You can't get away from it. It doesn't feel like it actually resolves anywhere. All right, but again, this is a part of photography, so we keep trying, and it's a great step in the right direction. Next image is by Jackie Spearley, and thank you. Obviously, you know, what can I say, right? When you come face to face with what I believe is a hippo, it's an amazing scene. Lots of energy here, lots of drama, because we know that this animal is big and really something that we will feel and experience in person. Is something that you really, I'm sure, is an experience you don't forget. I think the perspective of the picture is really good. I like the way we're really low down to the water, so we're kind of eye to eye and face to face. I also like the fact that it's coming right at us and we feel like we're right there in the scene. I think what can improve in the picture is not so much the composition, but I think it's the fact that outside of the hippo himself or herself. The rest of this is really kind of washed out, monotone, doesn't have any real interest. I don't know exactly what time of day this was made, but I would suspect that if we darken the exposure or we drop the exposure, we'll get a lot more interest and color in there. Okay, and I think that's what we need here. We need to create more of an environment for the whole image, because you've dedicated a lot of the picture to this water. It's got beautiful waves and ripples in it. Now it needs a little more variety. So we'll drop the exposure. We'll add some vibrance, maybe some saturation as well. That helps quite a bit. Makes it a lot more interesting. Okay, like that. I also think we will add a graduated filter from the bottom, just like that. And I'm just darkening the bottom of the picture a little bit, again, to create that variation. We can even emphasize that some more by going to effects and adding a tiny bit of a vignette. And last but not least, I'm now going to use a radial filter to create a simple circular shape around her face. And because we darkened the exposure, because we dropped the exposure, this is going to be brightened. Now notice that I'm brightening everything but the hippo. So what do? We come down to invert, and now we invert it so that the mask is being applied to her face, like so. So I'm going to brighten this up a little bit. Maybe we'll warm it up a touch by using the temperature slider just with this mask. And then maybe I'll apply a local adjustment to the eyes just to brighten the eyes just a bit. That's always a good thing to do with anything that has eyes, like humans and animals. And I think we are good. All right, so much more inviting on the right hand side. We still have the full energy of the animal. We still get that great perspective, but it feels a little warmer. It feels a little more natural, I would say. And I think that was just a question of finessing the adjustments, the interpretation of the image, so that we've got a little more interest to the whole picture as a whole. Next image is by, don't know. No name there. So here's an example of what I like to call two pictures in one. Really nice composition. Love the bottom part of the picture here with this lighthouse or this church on this beautiful cliff's edge, looking out over the majestic ocean. Amazing sky. But we have two pictures in one. Why? Because we've got one structure here that has one story and another structure out here that has a different story. And I don't really know which is more important. I don't know what we should be looking at, whether we're looking at a ship cruising out, plus we got the lighthouse in the foreground. The connection isn't clear to me, not to mention that we have another kind of vessel here. To show you how that would be much clearer and much simpler, let me select the spotting tool. And now we have a completely different image. And the reason is because now we've got one story, one center of interest, one thing that kind of tells us what we should be paying attention to. And then we've got everything else around it that supports, that unifies the picture. We've got one idea instead of two ideas that might be related, but I would argue that they cause more confusion than anything else. The other thing I would do to this image is maybe just warm it up in general, like that, so it's not so cool. Give a little more warmth to the sky and these clouds so we have more separation there. Maybe drop some of the blacks. And otherwise, I think the image is very well put together. You know, I mean, I don't know that we need to move the structure off center. Maybe you could move this a little bit in like that. But otherwise, I like I like the composition in general, the way it was put together. I think it's very evocative. It just gives us a sense of the vastness of the ocean with this lighthouse that is waiting for ships to come in or waiting for visitors or what have you. With the ocean liner there, with the cruise ship, it just creates, I think, more information than we need. Next, we have Cheryl Caton. Thanks for sending, Cheryl. So this image here is beautiful. I love the sunlight streaming in, backlit image with the foreground rocks and desert sort of environment. I like the again, the rawness of it. What we need here really is not anything to do with composition. I like the fact that my eye kind of obviously comes in here. That's the main shape. We may drift over here, but there's less light here, nothing that's really catching our attention. And then we kind of move through here and back up to the clouds. This area here is the part that I think should be working more, and it's not. Right now, what we have is your eye kind of goes here, and then maybe you see this, and then you're immediately here. And that leaves a lot of space here that isn't really doing anything for us. We need to create a bridge. We need to make the middle part of that picture more effective to create this sense of depth, foreground, middle ground, background. So how do we do that? Well, I think we can do some very quick adjustments here. So exposure-wise, you want to set your exposure for the general midtones in the picture, not the sun, because if we try to expose for the sun, well, then everything else gets too dark. So I want to open this up like so. Now we can see more into these shadows here. I'm going to add some clarity. Adjust our blacks. A little warmer. Then I'm going to use a graduated filter down like this. And I'm again going to use the range mask controls because I don't want to affect the entire sky because I find that it makes it too dark. I want to affect only the brighter parts of the sky, the highlights of the sky, not the shadows, because I don't want the clouds to go too dark. How do we do that? Well, instead of using, we're going to use range mask. We're going to limit the mask to a particular range. But the range is not going to be color, it's going to be luminosity or luminance. And the way this works is that now we have a range from 0 to 100, and with these two sliders at their maximum levels, meaning the left one is at 0, the right one is at 100, it means apply the mask to the entire range of tones. I don't want that. I want to limit it, or I only want to select the highlights. So we're going to move the left range control up towards the right, and now we're limiting the mask to just highlights. Notice as I move this to the right, how the clouds get a little bit brighter. See that? Darker clouds, brighter clouds. And that's happening because we're limiting the mask to just the highlights, so we can be much more aggressive now with this graduated filter, and it won't affect our clouds as much because the clouds are dark, and we've used the range mask to limit it just to highlights. Okay. I'll add some clarity to that. Now I'm going to use some local adjustments. Adjustment brush. And this is going to be dodging. And look at the light that's back here in the scene. I'm just going to pick up some of that light, sunlight back here, maybe out here, over here. There's some very basic hints of light back there. I'm also going to maybe make that a little bit brighter. Maybe some light here. Light that's already in the image. Then I'm going to create a new adjustment brush. Make this darken. And I'm going to drop the flow. And the reason why I'm adjusting the flow is because I don't want to apply this at 100% of the strength. I want to apply it in stages. And by using a lower flow, I can reapply the brush and it builds up. If I apply it at 100, at a flow of 100, once I apply one stroke, that's the full strength. I can adjust it here, but then it's going to adjust all my strokes. And I want to apply it at different amounts based on where I apply it by using a flow that's not 100. So for example, I want to darken this area here. I want it a little bit darker. I apply it again. But if I want to darken this area here just once, this is not as dark as this was because I applied this brush here twice because the flow is at less than 100, and as I apply it more and more, it builds it up. Okay, I hope that that's something you guys are understanding, but I'll keep showing it a few more times. All right, so that's that. Then I'm going to create one more brush, which I want this at 100% flow. I'm going to darken this rock here, which is in shadow. And maybe just a few areas here that we darken. Oops, too much on that one. There we go. Okay, I'm even going to cool that one off a little bit. And then last but not least, maybe just apply a bit of contrast to the entire image. And I think we're done. So the one on the left, you barely can kind of make out the middle ground there. The foreground is a bit weak. Doesn't really jump out at us.